Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it. I had a wonderful trip up on the train this morning from Delaware. The weather is not exactly cooperating, but fall's definitely here. But it was a nice trip up. I want to thank you for coming. I'm very excited about today. Problem-based learning is a wonderful pedagogy to understand and to learn more about. And so I'm going to do a very, very short introduction on PBL, very short. We call these mini lectures in the vernacular. And then we're going to jump right into a problem. You've heard, I'm sure, many of these desired capabilities when we talk about what do we want to get out of our college graduates. Communication skills, ability to define problems, gather and evaluate information, develop solutions. I was attending a talk by a gentleman named Rick Moog who talks about a concept similar to PBL. And he was asked in a workshop one time, how do I get my students to solve problems? When they come out of college, I want them to be able to solve problems effectively. And Rick's answer was right on track. He said, well, let me ask you a question. When they're in your class, how many problems did they solve? And he said the person just kind of sat there and looked at him for a minute and said, that's a good point. So whatever we want our students to be able to do, they have to actually do and exercise that skill. Team skills, the ability to work with others. And at the University of Delaware, we advocate the integration of team skills, communication skills, integrated all within one wrapper. And that's what we use within the concept of PBL. We integrate all of these within the problems that we use. And of course, the ability to use all of the above to address problems in a complex real-world setting. One of the big advantages of PBL is it's beyond just solving problems in the classroom. It introduces to a mindset of how to solve problems in real life. And so this is one of the things I want to show you today. So what is PBL? What is problem-based learning? If you get anything out of today's talk, and by the way, we do workshops. Our typical workshops are 2 or 3 days. So you're getting the flyby, okay? You're getting the Reader's Digest version, okay? The principal idea behind PBL is that the starting point for learning should be a problem. And that seems very obvious, I hope, but at the same time, it should be a problem, a query, or a puzzle that they want to solve. The students provide the actual legwork, sweat, and energy to solve the problem. So if you come away with anything today, that's what I want you to remember. So what are the common features? Well, as I mentioned, learning is initiated by a problem. Problems are based on complex real-world situations. When you're writing the problems, and yes, unfortunately, for many times you have to actually write your own problems, but when you're writing the problems, you want to actually come up with situations, ideally, that are based on real-world situations. This is really interesting. I mean, I was talking to this gentleman, James, here. He was talking about he's in physics. I remember the first time I took physics. Actually, I also remember the second time I took physics, by the way, but, and it was actually the same class. But when I took physics, I remember doing, you're doing traditional physics, and you've got this car, and it's braking, or no, I guess it was a sled on ice versus, say, something that was rolling. And in the problem, they gave you the coefficient of friction, right? So I'm sitting there, and I was at Drexel, and I was trying to figure this out, and I came up with a solution, and it made sense, and I was happy that I'd gotten it and all that. And so then I got done, and I thought to myself, who gives you the coefficient of friction in real life? Like if I actually have to, evaluate, where do you actually get the coefficient of friction? And that's given to you in most physics problems, right? I mean, they give it to you right in the problem. And I'm thinking to myself, if I had to actually solve this problem in real life, how would I even know what that is? It's not a constant. It's dependent on the actual surface. Rough surfaces have a higher coefficient of friction than ice, and So anyway, part of the goal is in a PBL problem, the PBL approach to solving this problem would be to give them 2 people colliding in an intersection, 2 cars in an accident colliding in an intersection, and then you have to figure out who was at fault. That's it. And you might even lay out the intersection for them. And you might actually show them the trajectories and maybe give them the speed based on eyewitness testimony or whatever. But other than that, they have to come up with a solution themselves. They have to make some assumptions about what the coefficient of friction might be. It's error-laden. It's assumption-driven. But guess what? That's real life. Students also identify, find, and use appropriate resources. We want our students to be able to do research when they get out. Now, maybe it isn't they're going to go out and actually write journal articles, but what we do want them to be able to do is use the library, use the internet effectively, evaluate sources, integrate those sources into the problems, and be able to do that once they graduate. And we advocate the use of using permanent groups. Some faculty differ on this. There are pros and cons to both. But we typically have, in our classes, we have students work in permanent teams. And then lastly, learning is active, integrated, cumulative, and connected. I tell my students I will never use PowerPoint. Unfortunately, I'm using PowerPoint this afternoon, so I have to look beyond that. But what I want students to do is when they walk in, from the time they're in my class to the time they leave, they're doing something from beginning to end. Now, I will do mini lectures like this, 15 minutes or so. We'll wrap up concepts, ask questions, do some interactive talk. But for the most part, they're actually involved and engaged while we're doing this. Okay, that's my talk. That's what you get. Any questions? No, I'm just... if you look at the materials that I've given you for today, you have a case. And actually, we don't call them cases, we call them problems. You have a problem. Ever-ready security. I would like, so we got, can I ask you, we're going to go ahead and join right here. That would be great. Now we'll have 4 then. As I mentioned to you, PBL, learning is initiated by a problem. So this is kind of our little joke. When I wrote this problem years ago, George Watts and I always used to talk about how you have to start with a problem when you do PBL. So what's the first line of the case? Marcia, we've got a problem. Okay, so that's the case. That's the joke. That's the joke you get for today. What I'd like you to do is read through the case, the problem, and in your groups, in your tables, start tackling the first question. Any questions? Go ahead. Get started.
I have to read my handwriting now.
Yeah, maybe Michael.
I have to.
Let's see if I can.
I wrote it down. All right, you want me just to read what we know?
Stand up.
Stand up.
Stand up.
It's hard to see.
I have
Yeah,
a
it is.
PowerPoint on this. So we thought we knew there was, we had some question about this actually. We thought we knew there was graffiti on the building because it was reported by Dennis. We did, we kind of accepted that we know that because we have the report, but then we also had this little discussion about, well, do we know until we go check it? We said we knew that Dennis is angry, that first we started by saying, well, we know it's a dark and cluttered area. When we had this discussion about how do we know what we know here, based on just the conversations, we started to kind of move this down here into what we need to know. Is the area really dark and cluttered? We knew that Steve was at work. There wasn't a report that Steve wasn't actually at work. Steve reported being at work. We talked about, well, we probably know what Steve's job responsibilities are. They probably don't include sleeping on the job. And we knew that Harley Davidson is an important client, so it seemed like that's important for us to keep that client. You want me to do the don't know as well?
Yep.
All right. We weren't sure. We don't know if Steve checked the area or not. Steve is kind of vague about that. Oh, it's a dark, scary place. We're not sure. We don't know that Steve sleeps on the job. We have an assertion that the manager suspects that Steve does. We don't know if the graffiti was on the building before Steve's shift. Dennis asserts that he's positive. He's positive, okay? But he doesn't say, I'm positive I checked it before Steve came in. He says, I'm positive. I see Steve, he looks sleepy all the time. So maybe Dennis isn't sure it was on there before Steve's shift. We don't know who wrote the graffiti. We talked a little bit about, connected with the responsibilities of guard and the important client. We don't know if there are, provisions to terminate the contract based on whatever sleeping on the job or something. While we started by putting graffiti on the building is definitely a fact, we weren't, the dark and cluttered area is a fact. We thought, no, maybe we're not sure about that. We didn't know if Steve was actually keeping the rounds. He's supposed to every hour go and do this. Steve doesn't say, yep, every hour I do the rounds. He kind of says, oh, it's a scary place. And then we kind of had some interesting discussions about issues that Steve and Dennis might have. that maybe Dennis has it out for Steve, maybe there's something kind of going on, something untoward. And then we thought, connected up with was the graffiti on the building before Steve's shift, we thought we probably want to know who provides the daytime security or who might have been involved in charge of security before this to see if we can collect information about when the graffiti happened.
Good list.
So sit down.
Any questions before we move on? Anybody disagree with anything that they've listed in the category? Okay, you're off the hook. Next group. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So obviously we know that there's some graffiti on the building.
But wait. This is something that every team came up with. Do we know, everybody, do we know that there's graffiti on the building?
We haven't seen it actually.
Some say yes, some say no.
But the owner says that, so we're going to trust them.
Well, the question is, okay, the point is that do we trust that Dennis isn't lying?
Well, I think we're seeing two sides to it. We're kind of, at one level we're saying that maybe it's there, but at another level we're saying maybe it's not there. Maybe this is a displacement issue. So we discuss both ways.
I could say, if maybe we move on to that question, but if it were me and I'm going out there and looking at that graffiti, yeah, no matter what. I mean, it's easy enough to confirm, right? So even if we take it as factual, I'm still going out there and seeing the graffiti before I make any choices.
It's multicolored too.
And it's multicolored, right? I mean, well worth the trip, right? Absolutely.
Did it, so
Right.
there's definitely some emotions that are unknown to interpret, but the security guard obviously was hired to do something. We may not know what he's supposed to do, but he's supposed to do something.
Right.
That's probably not sleeping. We all wish we had a job that we could sleep. We don't know when this really occurred. One, we don't know when the first time it occurred, and two, we don't know when the second time it really occurred. I guess we could estimate it happened within a 24-hour time period. But it probably could have been there for a much longer time, and we just noticed it now. This client, who's probably a very profitable client, is very upset, so the customer's unhappy. And the business owner, Marcia, feels as though she is going to lose a repeat customer. So that's a violation for the business. Obviously, like I said before, we don't know what exactly his job duties are, and we don't know when exactly this occurred, and we don't know what the threats are to this business. So is this graffiti opening up the door to robbery or any other sort of more violent crime? So exactly, that leads into, is the graffiti a source of deeper concern? Or is Dennis using this graffiti excuse because he's really got some really deep hidden problems that he just doesn't know how to express, so he's using this as a sort of a highway to express it. How secure is this area? What's the demographics of that area? Okay, is there a lot of crime in that area?
Yeah, good question.
That's good.
Absolutely.
We talked about displacement issues. How big is this facility, and is Steve humanly capable of doing his rounds if he's the only security guard? So if this is your college and we only have one security guard, is it realistic that we could say he could accurately secure the area? What are some of the other security factors we were talking about? When I got my alarm system in my house, the expert told me where to put my motion detector. I didn't say where to put it. So, what is the accuracy of these claims that Dennis is posing?
Good. Great list. Nice job. Nice job. Last group.
So in the end, we divided our list into what we really know and what we probably know, or what has been reported. So the things we really know are that Eveready will lose their client. and that the client is upset, that Dennis thinks that Steve is sleeping. So Marcia knows that, and they're the sort of important things she needs to focus on. The other things we think we know is that, because they were reported to us, is that it's the second time for the graffiti, that the area is dark and obstructed, and that Steve didn't report the graffiti. So that there's some disconnect between what Dennis reports and what Steve reports. And that's what we thought we really knew. And as Samuel said, what we really know is that something happened and the client is upset. So we don't know what, we may not exactly know what happened, but something did. So what Marcia doesn't know is if Steve was sleeping, if the area is as dark and obstructed as Steve said it is. And we also started thinking, well, if there was a first incident, we don't know what Harley-Davidson did to shore up the area, so something didn't happen for a second time. We also don't know who the perpetrators are. We don't know whether the first incident was reported, and we don't know if Harley-Davidson will respond by doing anything with the environment. So we don't know whether it's a problem for the security company to deal with, or if Harley-Davidson will participate in fixing things up. And the other thing that we don't know, this is the late addition to the list, is what does biggest client mean? Like, is biggest client the biggest client out of 600 clients, which is not such a big deal as the biggest client out of 300 clients. So we don't know what the load is and the consequences of not responding to it.
Great. Good. Nice job. You guys did a great job. One of the things about this case, and one of the reasons I developed this case, wrote this case, was I was teaching a class. I usually teach technology stuff. Okay, I'm a geek, so I usually do the technology stuff. And we had somebody on sabbatical who was teaching management, and they asked me to teach the management class. And so I said, okay, it can't be too hard, right? And then what I realized was it's a lot harder than I thought it was. Okay, first of all, and second of all, I was surprised that students weren't really being asked to make decisions. I mean, as a manager, one of the things that's a constant is you got to make decisions. And in some cases, you got to make decisions that are going to affect people's lives. This is a case that is based on my wife's company. It's not a security company. It didn't happen at Harley-Davidson. But the facts are pretty well, it's a completely different context. It was actually a network supervisor who was watching the network and was being accused of sleeping while he was supposed to be monitoring the network overnight. But the facts itself are actually the same, to be honest with you. And what I found is when I gave this case to my students, this problem to my students, the students came back and would say very general, well, we need to weigh all of the facts of the case and come down with a decision that makes everybody happy and all this. And I said, no, you got to make a decision. And the decision that you make is going to be, do you fire Steve? How do you placate Dennis? This is a real life situation. And you're going to have to do this. And what I found was that students had no yardstick, no guideline, no map as to how to go ahead and do this. This problem also illustrates a great thing about problem-based learning. It illustrates the methodology of helping people solve problems. The first question that I asked you is a traditional question in a problem-based learning situation. This works whether or not you are a manager, whether you're a doctor, or whether you're a biologist. And that is, what do you know, and what don't you know? And what you find out about this case is fascinating, is that there's very, very little that you know. It brings up issues of what does it really mean to know something? How do we actually know? Is there really graffiti? What is the standard that we set for knowing when somebody's job is on the line? Okay? What is the standard? How do we decide that we actually do know something? If you're a doctor, the first thing you do as a doctor when you go in and you see a patient is you find out, what is it I know and what is it I don't know? And what I know is when I talk to the patient and I ask them, what are the symptoms that you've seen? And what you don't know is what?
What he doesn't tell you.
What he doesn't tell you. And so what you don't know does what? What's the next step if you're a doctor?
Or you order tests.
Order tests, right? And it's the same framework, whether you're a manager, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a biologist, whether you're a chemist. You define what you know and what you don't know, and what you don't know becomes the guiding impetus for what the next step is. Because once you define what you know, the next step is to figure out and you've defined what you don't know, is to take the research and take the steps necessary to figure out, how do I find out this information now so I can make a decision? So it's the same framework no matter what discipline. And that's one of the great things I love about problem-based learning. Okay. Let me go ahead and let's do the next round of handouts. Okay. Oh, they're on the tables. Oh, see, they had the answers and didn't know it. This was also a case, I had a section on ethics, so go ahead and read the next stage of the problem. And actually, the United Technologies, I've done this with so many different companies, that really should be Harley Davidson, so it's a typo. Sorry about that.
Don't we do that all the time too?
What's that?
Well, since we know we can solve the problem in United Technologies, we go to United Technologies.
Well, we'll just ignore Harley Davidson. We'll just go out to the company we can solve, right? Yeah.
Oh, she's
I guess it's a pretty big client.
yeah, I guess it is.
Is that even legal?
Depends on the,
I think that's something we don't know, right?
depends on the state,
Yeah.
I think.
Let me put it this way. If I were ever ready and I went out to a client's site on their property and put a video camera, I don't know whether it's legal or not, but now the next phase of my class was on ethics. Okay, the next segment of this class was on ethics. And so this now became the impetus behind the problem behind defining ethical actions and defining the framework for ethical actions as to whether something was ethical or not, and on what standards do we use to evaluate the ethics of a situation. So again, the next question becomes, okay, the way I would start this before I got actually to the first question here was, no, we don't. I didn't include the entire framework. I figured you didn't want all that stuff. The other thing I gave you, because it's very important that when you're doing these problems, is that the next page of the handout that I gave you is a master list of the learning objectives that I try to accomplish with this case. These are really focused on the first phase, so you can take a look at those. And obviously, the problems that you define should tackle the objectives that you're trying to solve in your actual case. And as you're reading through those objectives, there's one thing I want you to look at, is that these are not only content objectives. These are also process objectives. Verbal communication, written communication, teamwork, meta concepts in terms of defining what is it we know and don't know, those types of things. So the objectives here fit into that first slide that I had in terms of what is it we want to accomplish with regards to our classes.
So it's sort of what it is.
But the goal of this particular thing is to find out what's still
Do we have a task?
No, not yet. I'm letting everybody read through the material. All right, let me get your attention.
Or if I was in the PR department.
A couple of things about this case. Let's go back to the first phase here. The first phase with this class, when I do this with my students, it becomes very, very interesting on what they come up with. And they tap into some things that I had really never thought of when I actually wrote the case. One of the most interesting things was a team came up with the possibility that this actually happened outside of Eveready's shifts. And Dennis was using the situation to blame, and to get the blame off himself, to blame, because he comes at it so hard. This is the second time it's happened, And he's like compensating. And so the students read into this that this was actually Dennis was trying to blame it on the security company so that he wouldn't get blamed since he was the person in charge of the factory. Right? Now, I'm not saying that's what happened. I mean, I don't know if it happened. But it becomes very interesting to see where students go with this and the discussions that happen around this. Because, the assessing of information becomes really important here. And if it really is, if we are taking everything that Dennis gives us as factual, that could be a problem. And Steve could end up losing his job based on something that somebody else said. And a couple of teams had used the word hearsay, which I think is a nice contribution to the discussion. In a way, this case almost puts the student in the form of a police officer. If you've ever seen those the police officer, the cop shows, they talk about they have to corroborate somebody's statement. They have to go out and actually figure out whether something was factual. They have to talk to witnesses, and it's the same type of thing. You really are putting students in the position of assessing the evidence in a case before they make a decision. Very objective, very factual. Now, are there any questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it also shows, I guess, the tenuous nature of so much knowledge and the importance of perspective. If you don't mind, I teach history, so our discipline is
Oh, yeah,
humanities.
absolutely.
So as you're doing this, I'm thinking, like how I might apply this if I was doing something, and you can use, let's say, historical situations.
Absolutely.
And try to recreate things. I won't go into detail, but one of the things we do emphasize with students is the different perspective that you get from reading different sources.
Absolutely.
So this kind of shows like a different perspective, Dennis' perspective, Marcia's perspective, Steve's perspective,
Yep.
and how knowledge is filtered in ways that one should be made aware of.
It's funny you say that because I was reading the paper the other day. It's kind of a timely discussion in the sense of how Christopher Columbus is now being interpreted differently.
Oh.
Right?
A whole lesson on that.
Right, yeah. And so it's the same type of thing. That before it was like, he was this wonderful man who came and, put the flag up and all that, and now it's being reinterpreted quite dramatically. And
Very
so,
much so.
absolutely.
Knowledge is based on who is creating it.
That's correct. That's correct. Now, one of the other things I want to go back to is that some of you may be saying, okay, this is all well and good, but how do I use this in my discipline? One of the examples I used earlier in the physics area is very much similar to how this case was written. And instead of taking your traditional physics problem, is turning it on its head and saying, here's an accident, give them the diagrams, here's the trajectories of the car, here's the speeds that they were traveling. What is it you actually know, defining that up front, based on eyewitness testimony, maybe by the words of the drivers. Of course, they're always going to, say they're going 35 when they're actually going 45, and keeping that into consideration. And then actually drawing up models and running the models to figure out who was actually at fault in the accident, who ran the red light, who didn't, those types of things. And you, again, putting them in the form of a problem solver as opposed to just what we call plug and chug problems, where they're putting in the answers and getting.
When professors use this format for teaching,
Hmm?
do you typically, besides breaking into groups like we did, then do you have representatives from the groups go up and address the whole
Yes.
class?
Yes.
And share this information like we are doing?
Yeah, when I create a problem, often the problems are multi-stage, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in my slides, but when I do a multi-stage problem, every stage at its conclusion, I want them to do some kind of oral or written communication to conclude that stage. So either an ad hoc presentation.
As a group?
As a group, yeah. And typically you're choosing one person from the group, but you might rotate them. Maybe a memo. Everybody is cognizant of the load of grading and how much, you don't want 10-page research papers. I find that 2-page papers work just as well as a 10-page paper. Because how do they make a 10-page paper? They start with a 2-page paper and they throw in a bunch of facts that are probably not as relevant because they have to expand it to 10 pages, right? What I want them to do is be able to take the data, compress it down, give me the facts of the situation, come up with recommendations, and support that conclusion. And that can be easily done within 2 pages. It's a lot easier for me to grade. It's a much better exercise. And in my discipline now, of course, in the business area, they're not writing 10-page papers when they go out. I think they should be able to do that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with writing 10-page papers, but from a business perspective, 2-page memos and 1-page memos are much more likely of what they're going to be writing in a business environment. So I want them to be able to synthesize that information and put it together into a memo that communicates what their findings are and be able to support it. Yeah. So to answer your question, I like to integrate both the communication objectives into the problem as much as I can because I want them to be able to do that as a result of doing the problem. Yes?
For part 2, you offer us the attached theories of ethics, which the students would have in the class.
Yes,
right?
correct.
So that's, if you will, there's the content. There's the chapter on ethics.
That's correct.
There's material.
That's
there's,
correct.
And you're using the case or the problem as a way for the students actively to sort of put that material to use.
Correct.
Right, so ethics in practice.
Right.
And I guess my question I want to ask is about you put us into this situation, we read this case. Can I mean, I can understand theories of ethics, I could even understand, decision rules for management. I mean, what would be in this particular example you put us through, what would be some of this kind of content that would be put into practice with the first part of the case here? Am I asking the question clearly?
Well, I think so. The clear, probably the overriding, I use this as more of an introduction to PBL. Because one of the weaknesses of this case is that they can't actually go out and research the company. Okay? It's not really Harley-Davidson. So it's not like they can go out and actually interview Dennis or look at the site. An ideal PBL problem is real in the sense they could actually go out and do the research. So this is more of an introductory problem. It becomes a problem also in workshops to have students working on laptops and researching companies and all that. And with a short time frame, this is the type of problem I typically use. But the overriding objective I want students to accomplish is to get into the mindset of how to solve problems. We talk about in class, for example, it's a silly question, but it has a really great point. And that is, as a manager, my wife was working one night. She used to be director of human resources for the Hilton in Austin, Texas. And she got a call one night. She was manager on duty at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the call was that a woman in her room killed a cockroach. And she was upset. And she wanted a new room. And my question to them is, what's the problem? And they look at me and they go, and I'm like, no, I want to know what the problem is. And so when we start getting into it a little bit, the problem here is the fact that there's graffiti. Okay? Right? But it's not really. That's the symptom. That's the symptom. I want them to start buying into the fact that what's tangible and we can see are symptoms. We can sit around here and whack cockroaches all day. That's not getting into the underlying problem. I want them to get to the underlying problem. And so this becomes an illustration. The cockroach question becomes an illustration. The true problem was that the night before, the banquet manager let his employees off because it was a very late party that was going on in the banquet room, and they left all of the dirty dishes in the hallway and didn't clean them. That was the problem. And so they ended up changing the procedures and letting the banquet manager know, you never do this again. You don't leave until the dishes are clean, because in Texas, you don't leave food out because it's going to attract roaches. And they had to fumigate the entire building. That's the problem, not the cockroach. The cockroach is the symptom. So that it kind of buys into that whole mindset of solving problems. Did I answer your question?
So I guess so this is kind of this would typically be kind of an introductory kind of thing to set the tone for how the class climate, if you will.
Correct.
It's the kind of thing we're going to be doing in this course.
Correct.
Every week, every day.
And full disclosure, I don't do this every day. All right? And the reason I don't do it every day, and I'll say this is my personal opinion now. I'm not saying that this is true of everybody. Some of the members of the ITUE team, for example, teach PBL every day. I personally find that any pedagogical technique done every single day loses its effectiveness. If I'm sitting there going every day, giving them problems, it's kind of, oh, God, I got another problem today, you know. It really kind of drove it home when I came in one day, and I didn't have time to get the problem together and all that, and I had a PowerPoint slide deck that I had used years ago, and I just said, okay, I'm going to lecture today. I don't typically do it, but I'm going to lecture today. I went up, I put my PowerPoint slides up, and one of my students, I swear to God, said, hey, cool, Serva's lecturing today. And, you know, I sometimes say now that learning is like a Hawthorne effect. You know, Hawthorne effect, when they raised the lights, productivity went up. When they brought the lights down, productivity went up. You change it up. Sometimes just the fact that you're changing things up a little bit has a desired effect. You do the same thing every single day, I think it kind of brings them down. So I don't do PBL every single day. I typically save it for things that I think can be used most effectively. Earlier this year, they had the pirates in Ethiopia, and they were, hijacking ships and all that stuff. And one of my colleagues, Beth Morling, she's in psychology, and she started talking about, she was reading the paper, and she said, this is so cool. And I was like, what do you mean it's so cool? She just think about the PBL problems that we could get to. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she started thinking about, well, okay, the fact that the snipers killed 4 people at the same time. What was the actual trajectory and the error level that was necessary to actually, given the distance and actually having them research the distance and actually, I'm going, okay, you're in psychology, but yeah, but I know, but okay, so the psychological effects. I heard this thing on NPR, and they were talking about how the pirates, the reason they're actually doing the hijacking was because American ships were polluting the waters and they can't fish anymore, so they're actually, so she started going off and I'm starting thinking, oh, I mean, everything in the paper, when you start reading it, becomes a PBL problem just because of the possibilities when you start reading it. But again, you don't want to do PBL to do PBL. I mean, you got to find the right problems. You got to find something that's engaging, that's interesting, that gets the students involved in it, and when they look at it and they go, wow, this is really cool. And the problem becomes the motivating factor behind it. If it comes across as being artificial, if it comes across as being canned, it's going to have the opposite effect. So you're absolutely correct. Now, I will tell you there are some resources, and I need to make sure I give you those resources. The page that, actually it's on that page, that's right. But there are some PBL problems in there that are broken down by discipline that might be useful as well.
When
Linda?
you talk about that the students have to actually go out and find the answers.
Well, research it. Research. Yeah.
Could this not be done online in class?
Absolutely.
As a group?
Yes, and we do that as well. We do that as well. And I mentioned Hal White, who's one of my colleagues. He actually gives them the journal articles or whatever it is, the materials to read.
I'm just thinking of time constraints of how much time we have in a semester to teach a course.
Well, that's a big philosophical discussion. But and I was talking to Deborah about this at the beginning. But I will tell you that PBL takes longer. Okay, and there are people on the ITUE team that disagree with me a little bit on that. But I think realistically speaking, it does take longer. But I start seeing I find that students, and I was talking to Deborah, I'm doing less, but focused. But I think I'm teaching less in terms of content. But I think what the result is the students are learning more. Because I'm starting to make some priority decisions in terms of this, to me, these are the 6 to 8 important concepts that I want them to walk out. So if I went up to them 6 months after the class was over, and I said to you, I want you to create an entity relationship model, they could do it. Because I'm spending more time on that. I want you to be able to do an SQL query with an inner and an outer join and explain to me why that's, whatever the concepts are that I'm teaching. Those are the things I want them to do. And what I found is that and I was telling Deborah when I started teaching, I told her, I said, I didn't think it was a coincidence that there were 15 weeks in the semester, and the book that they gave me had 15 chapters. Right? That's not an accident, right? Chapter a week. But what I found was the students don't prioritize in terms of what is the critical material. And by giving them all of that material, they think all of it's important. And so the end result is how much do they actually learn from those 15 chapters? So instead now, the problem becomes the driving factor. In terms of the chapter that I do on ethics, what I want them to do is read the material on the theories of ethics that I cover in the problem. And that focuses their attention on what they actually are supposed to know in terms of the material.
So is there going to be more outside of classroom reading and preparation, outside of class time, on their own?
Yes, in terms of the student, and this becomes, if they don't read the material before they come in, and I'm sure you don't have the problem that I have that before the students come in, they haven't read the material. I'm sure that doesn't happen here. Yeah, that's what I thought. But with a PBL problem, they go in and they go, now I find that quizzes, I do what are called 10-minute quizzes. I have 5 questions. They walk into class, they get 10 minutes. 10 minutes are plenty of time. They get them done in 5 minutes typically because there's only 5 questions. And they walk in, the first thing they do, bang, here's the quiz. And then we start doing the problem.
Are these high-stakes quizzes or low-stakes?
I give them anywhere, typically around once, I would say they're probably once every 2 weeks.
No, I mean, how much do they count?
Well, 20% of their final grade. Yeah, so this is not a minor detail. It's not a minor detail for them. It's enough to get their attention, but not enough that it would actually completely harpoon them. But it would differentiate between the B's and the C's in the class. Definitely. Yes?
Do you require them, when you're doing the solving of the problems, to refer to certain, concepts in the reading, or just fact-based?
No, I think you've hit on the biggest weakness of the problem that I've given you, and that is that it's all the material, the information is in the case that they can pull from. That's a weakness. A good PBL problem should require them to do research, to actually dig deeper. One of the problems that I've done in workshops, for longer workshops, is the issue of grade inflation. We've done that, for example, with faculty. Because one of the things, everybody knows what grade inflation is, but nobody really knows what grade inflation is. I mean, if you think about it, grade inflation is not the grades are going up. But what does it really mean? What is the underlying causes of grade inflation? And that's really what we start tackling in our workshop. And that's something you really have to research and actually dig into. It's a societal issue. It's a college issue. It's a faculty issue. It's a student issue. There's all kinds of issues that we have to talk about in terms of grade inflation. Yeah. So I think the best problems are ones that force them to do research. The physics problem that I was talking about earlier, that's actually a real problem. It was written by Barbara Duke. She actually has them run simulations to derive the coefficient of friction on an asphalt road. Doesn't give it to them. They have to actually run experiments to determine what the coefficient of friction is. So they actually have to do the experiments to figure out what it is. Yeah.
Couldn't you take, okay, unfortunately, I can't pull one out of my head right now, but I mean, there's so many ethical violations in business. And you should be able to pull out so many cases that did exist.
Sure.
You know, I mean, I could probably write 7 just on Enron.
Well, Skilling is up for, Skilling's was just approved by the Supreme Court, right? So,
Yeah, I can't wait.
yeah. So that's what I said. I mean, when I said earlier, I mean, you read the paper and you go, that's good, and writing PBL problems is a skill. I mean, I always say that it brings out the novelist in all of us because you have to do characterization a little bit. You know, you got Martian, you got Dennis. You know, you got to create people that they care about. So it's kind of like the budding novelist in all of us. But at the same time, you have to keep it anchored in the real world in the sense that they feel like they're solving a real problem. Now, I'm saying this just in case, I mean, it's a little marketing here, but in June of next year, ITUE at the University of Delaware is going to be running a workshop specifically focused on writing problems next year. And that's June, right now it's tentatively scheduled for June 7th and 8th. And I need to get back to you on that, Deborah, in case anybody else is interested in doing that. But that'll be down at the University of Delaware. We always do an outreach program every year, and that'll be in June on writing problems. And the goal of that will be that when you leave, you have at least one problem that you could run in your classroom. I have a few more things I just wanted to touch on. And one of the great things about this is you've actually anticipated a lot of my slides, so I don't. A typical day in a PBL course, well, you just saw it. Loud, noisy. I frequently will give my students extra credit based on how much noise they generate. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but if I have a really, really good day where students are just making noise and they're engaged and they're not checking email, they're not checking whether the Phillies won, and they're actually involved. And I tell them that up front in the first day of class. If you are working, and I do every semester, I try to give one of my classes or each section rather an extra credit point for actually being engaged in the class. Yes.
Yeah, I was kind of struck by this slide. This is a classroom, right?
That's correct.
And I just did a quick tally, about 40 students in there, maybe 50. It was only a part of the room.
Yeah, that's 208 Gore. That was specifically, again, full disclosure, that was specifically designed as a PBL classroom when the building was built.
And what's the size?
I think they fit 45 to 50 students.
Okay, so I mean, I had been thinking that this was like a smaller classroom kind of pedagogy, but I don't think of a 50-seat classroom as a smaller classroom necessarily.
That's right. Hal White, who teaches Introduction to Biology, completely PBL, has 200 students in his class. Now, that's not ideal by any means, and he uses peer facilitators. So what he does is he has seniors come back, and they get 3 credits for this, and they come back, and their job is to hold student sessions outside of class, for the homework that's due. Also to make sure the students are staying on task. They attend the actual, quote, lectures, although they're not really lectures. And so they run it that way. The great thing about that is that both sides benefit. The seniors come back and relearn and retake, to some extent, the biology, and they actually have to help the other students as they're going through. It's a great way to reinforce those concepts before they take the MCAT or any of those the graduate exams that they have to take. So it works very, very well at the University of Delaware. But he actually runs it with a 200-student class. So it can be done. Not ideal, but it can be done.
Well, I mean, I guess my question really is about, I mean, I think that's really intriguing. What's typical?
University of Delaware tries to keep their class sizes small. That's becoming more of an issue. My class sizes are in the high 30s to 40, typically. And so I'm running teams. You have to tailor the class. You have to tailor the problems to the class to some extent. Freshmen, you can't run the same problems with freshmen, obviously, that you can with seniors. And Freshman problems typically are more structured. They're more directed. You know, there's a little bit less open-ended nature to them, where you let them go off on their own, and you know. But at the same time, it gets them involved in the classroom. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you visit the groups as they're meeting?
I do.
Okay.
I actually do exactly. I try to model what I do in class during the actual. I sit down. I ask questions.
Right.
If I find that they're kind of getting off track, not in the sense of like checking email and stuff, but just kind of going off on the wrong track, I try to pull them back a little bit. So I am actively going around in the classroom, yes. Yep. This is the PBL process, and you've kind of experienced it. We present the problem. We get them to organize the information in terms of what do we know. Then we pose questions. What do we need to know? We assign responsibility for questions, and this is often where the first stage of a problem ends, as is the first class. They go off and they do some research. They research the questions, analyze the findings, reconvene and report back on their research. They integrate the information, refine their questions if necessary, and then we go to the next stage. And by the way, one of the things that strikes me about this, if this looks at all familiar to you, especially the people in the sciences and all that, this is largely the scientific method. I mean, this is largely, and that's one of the reasons that, you know, we're not teaching science in my information systems class, but in a way we are. Yes?
When you say they go off and do their research, is that individually, or they get together as a group outside of class to do their research?
It really depends on the nature of the questions. Okay? Sometimes things that are more discussion-oriented, they have to go off individually, do the research, come back in, and then process it, synthesize it, and come up with recommendations.
I've seen some of this in other courses that I've been involved in the past, and what happens is that they have the problem, and they divvy it up. I'll do this, you do that, I'll do this, you do that, it'll take us each 10 minutes, and then
Right.
you know, we come back together and we pool it. I mean,
Right.
is that cheating, or is that okay? Or?
I have a framework where I'm talking about the best PBL problems. If that's the type of PBL problem that is being offered, that's going to be a weakness of the problem. Because the questions that you want them to be able to research requires them, they can't divide and conquer the problem. They should have to work together and discuss and argue and synthesize and evaluate and actually get those higher learning skills in place to actually come up with a solution. If it's a divide and conquer problem, then it becomes a problem. You can't really do that as a PBL problem then. Yes?
It just struck me, I'm in teacher education.
Yes.
I mean, you teach this to first graders with KWL. You know, that
Yeah.
it starts, you can start this kind of thought process with 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds. You know,
Yep.
what do you know? What do you want to know?
Right.
Research it, group work, cooperative learning. What did we learn?
Yep.
Write it up, go to the next step.
Yep.
And so it can follow students all the way through.
It's a great point. And you know, one of the things that one of the greatest things I ever did with my kids was Odyssey of the Mind. And this is Odyssey of the Mind. Right? And when they're 8, they just think this is the greatest thing in the world. And now I have a 14 and a 15-year-old, and they're going, Dad, I don't want to do this, you know. And so somehow we lose that. They run out of steam somewhere around 11, 12, I don't know. And they just run out of steam. And we kind of, I just sometimes feel if this were more like college, you know, if this were more like secondary education, you know. A friend of mine I went to high school with teaches secondary education, and he teaches physics. He was able to get a junk car and a crane donated. And so the students actually figured out the trajectory of the car and the velocity of the car when it was going to hit the sidewalk. That was part of what they had to do. Then they went out in the parking lot and did it. So that's cool. That's cool. Okay. Communication within the group. I do a whole section on communication and teamwork. Republic Polytechnic is in Singapore. This is a very interesting institution. I visited there earlier this year. Their university's mission is one day, one problem. Every class is PBL. And what's interesting is that, you know, ITUE, the organization that I work with, we do a lot of workshops. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them, I would say 60% or so, are out of this country. And what's interesting is that the United States is dragging in terms of this, is lagging in terms of PBL. It's really hot in Singapore, India, Taiwan, very big in Taiwan. You know, a lot of countries are really embracing this as being a way of really getting their students excited about education.
And that brings up cultural differences in educational practice.
Yes.
We
Yes.
are very, as a very individualistic, you know, everybody
Yes.
does their own thing, as a, you know, the East versus West cultural patterns of learning, of teaching, you know, working as a group, working for the better, you know, betterment of the whole, as opposed to our very individualistic ways of.
I agree. I agree.
So I know that PBL is used a lot in med school.
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's where it came out of originally. Yes, McMaster. Yes. Yep.
Because I did a workshop some time ago at one of the med schools, and it was for family and parents, you know. It was for the family and parents whose children were in med school, and that was where I first, you know, got a full, I think it was 2
Yep.
days of PBL, not for the students.
Right.
But
Well, and if you think about it, medical school, I mean, medical diagnosis is problem-based learning. I mean, you're presented with the problem, and now you got to go out and figure out what the problem is. You first define what is it you know by asking questions of the patient, and then you figure out what you don't know, and you do the test, which is exactly what we talked about.
Before we move to your next point, I just
Yeah.
want to pick up on something that Linda, you had said a moment ago. Business and cultural differences, or, you know, being very individualistically focused here. I mean, this is a common problem. I'm sure you encounter this all the time. Working in groups is a challenge for, well, us as faculty, but our students as well.
Yes.
Particularly when so much is based on individual performance. We're used to being measured individually. And in your class, when you do this, and it's a group, you know, the group environment, I mean, there are issues with that. And
Yes.
part of it is they're learning about navigating group dynamics.
Right.
How do you deal with laggards? How do you,
Yes.
right? I mean, can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah,
I mean, you said, you know, you have stable groups.
Yes.
You know, I do a lot of group work in my classes, and I know why that makes sense. They become accustomed to each other, and
Right.
that sort of thing. At the same time, if you got those A students in there, and they're in there with those students who are always barely passing classes, that can be very frustrating for them.
Yes.
And anyway, can you talk a little about this?
Yeah,
Those issues?
I do a whole section on this, and it's something I've spent a lot of energy on. I really believe, I've been doing teams ever since I started teaching, but it was only until about the late 90s that I realized that I was like expecting students were going to magically determine how to be good teammates. It was going to bubble up somehow, because I never talked about it in class. I just put them in teams and, you'll figure it out, right? But the problem is they don't. And so one of the things I started doing in my classes was I do a lot of preventative measures. I require them to draw up a code of conduct. So this is what's going to happen. But I don't, because I think one of the mistakes that we make, or I used to make anyway, was that I'd give them the assignments, stressful, difficult things that they had to do, and they had no rapport to fall back on. They didn't even know each other's names. I'd have students come in and say, I got a problem with my teammate. I'd say, which one? He'd say, I don't know his name. Okay? And that interpersonal connection, the human moment, the stuff that I do in my research sometimes, you got to know who people are. And so one of the first things I do when I put students in teams is I do exercises. They're more than just icebreakers. They're getting to know who they are, what their interests are, what are the things they like to do, what role they want to play in the team. I mean, I spend a whole class and then we talk about it afterward. And I think that investment of time is critical. They need to have a rapport so that when they actually do get into stressful situations, they can feel comfortable saying, look, we got an issue here. As a matter of fact, I just got an email, no kidding. I was checking my iPhone right before we started, and I have a student who emailed me and said, look, I've got a problem with my teammate. And it was the only student who added the class a week after the classes started, and she was the only one who didn't participate in my team events. Now, I'm not drawing conclusions on that, but I think it's interesting that she's the only one who didn't go through all the icebreakers and all of the exercises that I go through, and she's the one that I'm going to have to deal with when I go back to the office. It's more than just icebreakers. I mean, when you walk down the street and you bump into somebody in the subway, okay, you don't even know that person's name, you don't know their face, you won't remember them 3 minutes from that, from the point that happened. When you get to know who somebody is, it's much more difficult to slack in that situation if you have some kind of buy-in, interpersonal buy-in, and that's what I try to establish early on in the semester. Now, I'm not directly answering your question and giving you like how to, but I do have materials on it, and I'm more than happy to share them with you if you'd like to see them. Yep.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah, Lynn.
Just said, first of all, do you assign groups or do you let the students group?
Good question. Good question. I never let students choose their own groups. No. And I always get the question when I actually have the classes, and students say, well, why can't we choose our own teams? And I said, there's a very good reason, because you do a lousy job. And they laugh, and I'm like, because over the years I've had fraternity brothers on the same team, one big brother, one little brother, and guess who did all the work, okay? I've had roommates who got mad at each other in the middle of the semester and kick the other one out of the room because his parents own the apartment and you're not living here anymore. I've had, you know, every possible scenario. I had 2 students from one country, no, 3 students, 3 female students from one country and a male student from a country that the other one was at war at the time, okay? And they were the only reason they got on the same team was they were the last 4 left, and they just looked at each other and went, yeah, okay. Yeah. So the reason I do it, though, is there's a broader reason than that. And the projects that I give them tend to be cross-disciplinary. So I go through very carefully. I want to make sure I have accounting students, marketing students, finance students. I distribute them by major because I want them to have different skills. If there's a technology project, I want a technology person that I know can do the job by major or whatever on that particular project. So I'm very careful about it. I invest a lot of time, as I mentioned earlier, into the teams so they have a rapport. Now, I will tell you that I do ad hoc stuff on occasion, but it doesn't tend to be for major assignments. They tend to be more like in-class exercises that I do just to illustrate a point for that day.
Thank you. My second question then is, each individual group draws up their own code of conduct?
Yes.
And so then they hold the members of that group accountable?
Correct.
To the code?
Yes.
So they decide what needs to be in this rules
Yes.
of conduct?
Yes, and in all the years I've done it, I've never had to use it.
Okay.
But just the fact, psychologically, going through that process of saying, it's called cognitive dissonance. I mean, if you go through and you actually say, well, I would never slack on a project, or, you know, if we're going to meet, we really should be telling each other, how likely is it that you're going to actually violate that rule later on if you're the one that came up with the rule? We don't like to be hypocrites. And so what I get them to do is not only come up with the rules, sign it, they have to date it, sign it, turn it in, yes, we agree to this, yes, we agree to follow this. And that way, if I do have any students who violate it, I pull it out and I say, look, this is what you agreed to, and this is what you're doing. So, and this is what it says I'm supposed to do. So what do you want me to do now? Okay? And that's one of the reasons I don't tend to have as much trouble with them later on. Yes?
Yeah, my question is how you grade them. You give the individual grade for
Yes.
the homework, or you have the product, you have a grade partially and then partially participation.
That's another great, you guys are coming up with great questions. The great thing is I don't have to go through the slides. That's what's good. I don't like slides anyway. So, in terms of grading, I think it's extremely important you have individual accountability. Okay? You have to have that in a class. And you can't do all group work all the time, because then that's actually an incentive for one person to sit back and say, well, I'll just not do any work because I'll just pick it up from everybody else. I don't have to do the reading. They'll tell me what I need to know. So there has to be individual accountability, first of all. Second of all, these problems do tend to be more not subjective, but there is no one right answer in many cases. A good PBL problem should not have a single right answer. Okay? It should be up to interpretation in terms of the assumptions that they made, and then they actually come up with an answer based on the assumptions. So you have to come up typically with rubrics, you know, some kind of guidelines in terms of, you know, does the argument that they're making make sense? Is the conclusion that they draw, does it follow directly from the assumptions that they've made? You know, those types of things. You have to come up with a rubric to grade it. I don't grade on percentage basis. I use like a check system where I'll do like a check plus equivalent to an A. Check minus might be B plus A. A check might be a low B, you know. And I do it that way because I can defend it. I can't differentiate between an 88 and an 86 on a PBL problem typically. But if I do enough of them over the course of the semester, in the end, it averages out pretty well. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm just wondering for the end result, when you give that grade, well, that's the whole group will get the same.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, I do. And I used to do the whole thing about dividing points. You know, like some people give out points and then you divide them up. I don't like that, to be honest with you, because I think it undermines the group cohesion. You know, it becomes a zero-sum game. If I get a point, you got to lose a point. So I don't like that. So I give them all points, but I have a system. I always give them an evaluation, a team evaluation form at midterm. Mine's actually going out next week. And I encourage them. They have to be honest about it. They have to turn it in a sealed envelope, and they have to put it in my mailbox. I don't do them in class, because if they do them in class, they sit next to their team members, and there's too much pressure. They can actually see what they're writing. And they won't write comments, because if they write comments, then there must be something they don't like about me. Okay, so I give it to them. They take it at the end of class. I give it to them. They have to turn it with an envelope, sealed envelope, and put it in my mailbox. Anybody who has problems, if there's a team member that I have a problem with at midterm, I sit them down and I say, look, we've got an issue here. Your team said that they're concerned about your contribution. And I make it in very strong terms. I say, look, I reserve the right. It's in my syllabus. I reserve the right to dock you 2 letter grades. at the end of the semester. Given what your team has said right now, you're in danger of having that happen. And so I'm going to be monitoring the situation, and I expect improvement. And if there is an improvement, then there's going to be consequences down the end, because it isn't fair that your team gets an A and you get an A too if you haven't been contributing. So I do have a process in place for that. But in general, yes, they all get the same grade. But in the end, I make the correction if I have to. Yes?
How much is, I think maybe, how much is the teamwork based, how much of the teamwork, what percentage of the grade is the teamwork?
Teamwork, typically around 40%, okay? Because I do want there to be individual accountability. And so I don't want the teamwork to flood the grade to the point where there isn't differentiation. So it's around 40% typically.
And with this Eveready thing?
Yeah.
You gave us 2. Do you keep going with Eveready? Is there more questions?
There's only 2 stages to the Eveready problem.
Okay.
I've thought about a 3rd stage, but I haven't taught that class now in like 3 years. But most of my problems now are more technology driven. Yeah. Oh, we're actually, we're at the end here. I'm glad to answer more questions. If people have to leave, I just want to.
You said you have 40% as your team grade. Previously, 20% was quizzes. How do you make up the rest of the grade?
Exams, individual exams. Yeah.
You still do have
Yeah.
individual exams.
Right.
And are the exams problem-based or multiple choice or short answer?
It depends, to be honest. It depends on the class sizes. It depends on my number of preps in the semester. It depends on a lot of things. That's a practical answer. It's what I will do, and actually I did this last night in my my web design class. They have an exam next week, and I gave them a test. Actually, it wasn't a test. I thought it was a pop quiz, and they walked in. They were like, "Pop quiz?" And I'm like, "You got a test next week. You should be ready to go, right?" And by the way, our fall break is this weekend coming up. It actually starts. It's tomorrow. And so they came in, and I gave them a tough quiz. Really a tough quiz. And they're looking at me like, "Okay, wait till you better get to your car before I get to your car." I'll tell you, that type of look. And so when I got done, I said, "Okay, now what did you guys think?" And they were like, "It's better not be the test." And I went, "This is what you should know by now. This is what you should know by now." Now, what I want you to do is, this side of the room is going to take 1 through 8. This side of the room is going to take 9 through 16. And this side of the room is going to take 17 through 23. Sheets of paper, brought them out. Actually, we had whiteboards in the class. So I said, take the markers, put your answers up there. I want you to get up there, and I want you to defend what you wrote down. If you don't know the answer, tell me, and let's talk about why you didn't know the answer. And let's figure out what the answer is. And so there was no, in the sense I didn't grade it. But there should be formative assessment in the sense that we give them feedback on where they are at that point of the semester. I don't want them to get that feedback after the exam is over. I blew it. I thought I knew it, right? So at this point, when they walk out of the classroom, I say, look, you know exactly where you are for the exam. And the exam will not be the exam, but it will be very similar. So you know what the exam is going to look like. You know what you have to know. And you've got a week now to catch up if you're not in shape for it. And you've got a week to come and ask me questions. So that's kind of a PBL approach to a midterm review.
Is there a college around here that, has already started PBL?
PBL, in the United States, to have a university that does pure PBL is unusual. Alabama's Samford was known for that, although I think they are not using it right now. But there was a Samford Institute down in Alabama, I think it was, that was using it quite extensively. Outside of the U.S., there are definitely universities. But outside of the United States, it's very different. When we went to Turkey, we went to a university in Turkey, Dokusilolu University in Izmir. The president was an orthopedic surgeon of the university. And the president stood up in front of the faculty and said, you will use PBL now. You have until September to implement it in your classes. Can you imagine the president of Ohio State going in front of his faculty and telling his faculty that? No. No. So it's a little bit of a different situation, okay? And so so that was one of the reasons we went in there, is because the dean of the college, the business college, was going, how do we do this?
And you said in India the polytechs use it?
A lot of the polytechs do. A lot of the Pacific Rim universities are using it now.
And are those the same ones that, I know in India the polytechs kind of populate Silicon Valley, the graduates of are those the ones that are very hard to get into in India?
Those are the ITs, like the IITs, right? We went to, James, did you have? Yeah, there's 5 of them, and they're all considered like that's their MITs of
Right,
you know
right, right.
you know
No,
higher.
they're well known.
Yeah, very well known. Yeah.
Did you say McMaster is the father of PBL? That's where it was born?
In the United States, yeah, in Canada, it came out of McMaster. New Mexico has always been a leader in this area as well. Sanford down in Alabama. Maastricht.
But did it originate?
I believe that's correct. I believe that's correct.
I'm only asking because I'm planning on going to the
Yeah.
event
They're,
and see them do it.
they're very well known, and they're very well developed in that area in terms of PBL. They do expect their doctors to learn through the PBL approach. Yes.
When I was in college, this was quite some time ago, we did a lot of this in business courses, case-based. You know, so you have like chapters, but you have a case,
Yes.
and basically, you know, the case forms the
Right.
the arena within which you bring the material. You know, you bring the course material to bear.
Right.
How would you distinguish that from? I mean, it has some overlap, certainly.
Yep.
Though I'm sure that you would say there are differences.
Yep.
So, because case-based, this kind of approach is that's old and I think a lot of people say used quite frequently, but maybe that's different from problem-based learning, or maybe it's a PBL light or PBL easy, or.
Well, it's a great. You guys asked some really good questions. I mean, I mean it. I mean, fantastic questions. The Harvard Business School model. The biggest difference between the Harvard model and the McMaster PBL model is that you look at a Harvard case, and I did them in the MBA program when I was at Syracuse. Okay, and a Harvard case gives you all the information in the case that you need to do to basically solve the problem. That's why the case is so long. Some of them are 20, 30 pages, right? A PBL problem is often 1 page. Because the difference is that they present you the problem, but they don't give you any of the facts. As a matter of fact, most people, when they write a PBL problem, write too much. Hal White's, who we consider to be the best problem writer in our group, okay? Hal White's problems are about this long, typically. You know, grade inflation is a conversation between 2 faculty about grade inflation. That's it. And then the first question is, what do we know about grade inflation? What don't we know? And then you go off and you do the research. That's the biggest difference, is that the PBL starts with a problem, but doesn't include any of the facts, or very few of the facts. Because anything that you do to actually include the facts in the case, beyond what students should be researching, is short-circuiting the research process. So you want to try to keep as many of the facts out of it as possible, if you can. This is obviously a fictional scenario, so I have to put more information in it. But with the PBL approach, a couple of paragraphs can often be sufficient. That's the biggest difference. And that's why I try not to call it cases, although sometimes I do that. It's really, we should use the word problem.
Can I follow up?
Absolutely.
As I think about those cases, I agree with you completely. They're like chapter length.
Right.
They had a lot of information. You weren't expected to go out and do outside research.
Financial statements and yeah.
You mentioned before that in a senior level course, you bring the students have a lot of background knowledge they can bring to bear on the issue. But if it's a lower level course, then you've got to be more guided and more structured.
Right.
Can you maybe talk about, because as I'm thinking about that,
Sure.
you take a bunch of freshmen and you put them out and you say, go out and do some research on this. Probably not going to be as successful. And maybe you want to kind of circumscribe the PBL in some way. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of lower level?
Yeah. Now, I will say that Hal White teaches PBL. Now, he's an exemplar in terms of PBL. Okay, so Hal White is a biochemist, and he teaches his intro to biology class 100% PBL with freshmen. Okay, so it can be done. But people who are getting into PBL, and I also acknowledge the weaknesses of PBL. I mean, there are, like I said, I don't do PBL every day. And I think sometimes getting students to actually, freshmen coming in out of high school, mixed levels of expertise, they are coming into high school, taking an intro to biology class or physics or whatever, that might be difficult. I mentioned to Deborah in an email that there is a technique coming out of Franklin and Marshall called POGIL. It's Process-Oriented Guided Instruction and Learning, and it's POGIL. And there is POGIL.org, and Rick Moog is the one who's developed this technique. I do consider like PBL light. And I think of it as being much more appropriate for freshman level classes. I wouldn't do it in a senior class. It's very much structured. He gives them worksheets. It is discovery learning, inquiry-based learning. He does give them open-ended questions, but he guides them through the process a little bit more than, say, a PBL problem would. And I think for people who are really interested in getting into more discovery learning, investigative type approaches to learning, I would really consider, especially in a freshman and sophomore level, I would really look at POGIL. as being a great opportunity for that. And Rick has really done a great job with that at Franklin and Marshall. I saw him speak, and I love the stuff that he does in his teams. He does fantastic stuff in his teams. He's really good with teams, too. So POGIL.org, it's a full website, a lot of materials out there for along that line. Yeah.
Let's finish this up and
Yep.
thank Dr. Serva very much for a very informative and
Sure.
helpful.
Thank you.